She is almost home. The night has a November chill that slides through the open window of the sedan, and the streetlights smear like low-watt brushstrokes along the dashboard. Angela Hayes touches the edge of her sequined dress with a thumb, feeling the rough thread beneath the smooth finish, and smooths her hair in the rearview mirror. The fundraiser ran late. She carried a stack of leaflets and a small paper cup with coffee gone cold. On the passenger seat, a program from the community center peeks out of a canvas bag. Her phone buzzes once on the center console, an incoming text, and she lets it ring. She is tired in all the familiar heavy ways that come after doing work you believe in. From behind, a flash of red and blue cuts the mirror into a sharp, jagged frame. Angela's breath forgets how to be small. The lights sweep over the rack of pamphlets, paint her fingers in alternating color. She blinks. The sequins tremble. A cruiser slides into view, then another. No siren. Just the sudden order of light and sound that rearranges a calm evening. She pulls to the shoulder. The car hum of the city is replaced by the low thrum of police engines and the soft rattle of distant tires. The patrolman's flashlight glances off her rear view and steadies on the curve of her jaw. An officer approaches, hands folded at his waist, the air between them taut with the kind of authority that needs no explanation. "License and registration, please," the older officer says. His voice is flat. It is practiced. Angela unfastens her seatbelt with one hand and reaches into her purse for the registration. She slides the folder across to his outstretched hand and meets his eyes for a single beat. She gives him the polite words society taught a black woman too young to remember when. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" He does not tell her. He asks for her license again in a tone that implies a subtext she cannot decode. The younger officer lingers by the rear of the car, fingers brushing a notepad but not yet writing. His face has a look Angela knows well from meetings and community check-ins, nervousness threaded with a desire to belong to whatever the older officer is embodying. Between them, the two blue lights pulse, and the highway hum presses against the closed windows like judgment. She stays calm because she is taught to, because anger in this light becomes something that can be used against her. She answers in measured sentences. She explains she is heading home from the fundraiser, mentions the pamphlets on the seat. She says her husband is a public servant. She does not yet know that will matter. The officers lean into the car and say they will search the vehicle. They give no reason. One of them tells her to step out. Angela's hands are visible as she slides the door open. Cold hits her bare calves. A bystander across the street glances up from his phone. A neighbor on the porch stops mid-sip, watching. The search is quick at first. Cursory hands rummaging through the canvas bag, the officer's gloved fingers fumbling with papers. Then it grows more intrusive. He lifts the cushions, peers under the seat, pulls at the edge of the carpet. Her handbag is turned inside out on the trunk like a domestic scene-made criminal. No probable cause shown, Angela thinks. Clarifying nothing changes her body's requests for obedience. She wants to call Malcolm. The name rushes up like oxygen. Her thumb moves to her phone, and an officer sees it and seizes the moment. He takes the device from the console with a motion that says he can. "You can't use your phone right now," he says, with the same flatness as before. He does not offer a reason. A small group is forming at the corner. Heads tilt toward the flash of red and blue. Phones come up like a field of silent sentries. Someone signals to a neighbor. "Record this." The sound is barely a whisper, but it multiplies. Angela's chest tightens around the knowledge that her life is suddenly public, a scene staged outside where private humiliation is allowed to be an audience sport. She repeats that she does not understand what this is about. She repeats that everything in her purse is personal, that the papers in her bag are from the event she was just attending. She asks for the supervisor. One of the officers shrugs as if the word is heavy and annoying. The older officer tells her to calm down. The younger officer avoids her eyes. When she finally gets through to Malcolm, his name lights up the screen and relief rushes like warm water through her. He answers on the second ring. "Angela?" His voice cracks with a kind of professional stillness, a person used to managing the rest of the room when things threaten to get messy. "I'm being searched," she says quietly. the syllables clipped to keep her voice low. They won't tell me why. They took my phone. He asks where she is. He asks about the officers. She tells him everything she can in an even cadence that keeps her from being swallowed by fear. He reassures, "I'll be there." And the promise of his presence is immediate oxygen. He is not just her husband tonight. He is a commissioner, a man who wears a badge that announces authority and accountability. But she does not call him for the badge. She calls because the knot of public exposure feels too heavy for one person. The older officer steps back from the trunk and Angela can see the line where professionalism blurs into posture. He pats a pocket like checking for an excuse. The younger officer's pen finally moves, scribbling something that looks like a reason. From the crowd, a neighbor's camera catches the arc of all this small drama. The flashlight that slices the back seat. Angela's hands folded over her bag, the way her dress catches the light. The clip is 5 seconds long at first, then 30. Then it is uploaded. A dozen people comment, then 100. Views tick upward as if a virtual tide is forming to wash over the scene. Malcolm arrives in 10 minutes that feel like a year. He steps out of his car with movement taught by decades in public office. Direct, unadorned, calibrated to command attention without demanding it. He is still in a suit, tie loosened from council meetings, but his badge is clipped to his belt and glints when the cruiser lights hit it. For a moment, two worlds collide. Angela's personal vulnerability against his institutional presence. The glint of his badge refracts into the phones lifted around them, creating a chorus of light. He walks up, hands visible, and says, "What is happening here?" His voice carries an authority that is not shouted. It is simply known. The older officer offers the same flat phrases he offered 2 women earlier, but there is a pause that did not exist before Malcolm's arrival. The officers exchange glances like sailors checking for the wind. "You are the commissioner?" the older officer asks, as if the title needs interrogation. Malcolm leaves no space for a performance. He nods. "I am. My wife says she was pulled over. She was searched. She says no one explained why." Those nearby hush. The cameras point. A woman on a stoop mutters, "Thank God he's here." The younger officer's calves shift. The older officer straightens as if the physical politics of the scene realign. Power, which had congealed in the officer's advantage, dissolves into an awkward uncertainty. The lead officer steps toward Malcolm, then hesitates. "We had reasonable suspicion," he says. The words are soft, less like a claim, and more like an offering to be challenged. Malcolm's eyes do not harden. He keeps them steady. He asks for details. He asks to see the notes. He requests that the supervisor be called and that everything be documented. He does not demand that the officers be stripped of their authority on the curb, but he insists transparency and a chain of custody for the search. This insistence is not performative. It is the work of someone who recognizes institutional risk when it stands at the edge of private harm. He calls in Lieutenant Charles Donovan by name. Donovan arrives, a uniform more neutral than the tired blue of the cruiser, and his expression holds the kind of conflict that comes from being part of a machine whose pieces sometimes grind badly against each other. The crowd, sensing the shift, edges closer. Phones multiply. The presence of Malcolm wearing his badge changes the choreography in a way the officers did not anticipate. Their posture retreats. Their flatness becomes defensive. The older officer, who had seemed immovable, grows small under the weight of recorded witnesses, and the commissioner's steady request for accountability. "You will document everything," Malcolm says. "You will explain to her why she was stopped, and you will provide a copy of your report to her, to me, and to your supervisor. No private handling." The lead officer blinks. He starts to explain, stumbling through phrases that try to justify a stop that had no clear articulation. They talk about matching descriptions, suspicious behavior, vague terms that would survive in a report, but offer no sense to Angela in the moment. Malcolm presses for specifics. He refuses to let standard language flatten her experience. The younger officer, who had been watching the scene like someone waiting for cues, now records his own notes with a new care. The older officer's jaw tightens. A radio crackles at his shoulder. He answers, voice clipped. The hum of the street presses in. A few neighbors start to voice small affirmations. "Let her have her phone back. someone says. Another person mutters, "This isn't right." Under the glare of public view, the power dynamic shifts from a private assertion of authority, one officer over a woman alone, to a public forum where accountability is demanded. Malcolm does not make threats. He simply applies institutional tools, requests, documentation, witness accounts. The scene is no longer merely about Angela's humiliation. It becomes a question about practice and protocol. The older officer, sensing the crowd's focus and the commissioner's expectations, places the phone back on the console. No apology, but the device returns to her hands. Angela's fingers close over it as if reclaiming a small piece of herself. She takes a breath that is both relief and the echo of indignation. Lieutenant Donovan stands between protocol and public demand. He listens to the officer's side, then listens to Malcolm. When he speaks, his voice tries for balance. "We'll open an internal review," he says. "We'll notify internal affairs." The words are procedural, but the procedure matters. Because in a climate where trust is frayed, procedure is one of the few ways institutions can repair the ruptures they create. The officers are placed on administrative leave the next day in the narrative arc that follows this curbside confrontation. The internal review begins. The clip from the neighbor's phone, a shaky minute and a half of humiliation, and then of Malcolm's arrival and calm insistence, circulates through social media. Coverage picks up. Local pages and community groups thread into it, debating what happened and how it was handled. In the coming days, Angela sits in a room stacked with newspapers and video stills, feeling as if the scene is replaying in the tissue of her wrists. Reporters come with questions, some kind, some not. Malcolm stands beside her at a press conference not to be the hero of the story, but to insist on particular facts. That procedure will be followed, that witnesses will be heard, that the department will be transparent in its outcomes. He does not offer absolution to the men on leave. He calls for an impartial investigation and for community oversight. Angela speaks into the microphone with a clarity that surprises even herself. She speaks about dignity. She speaks about the moment of being searched in her own car and how the world rearranged itself in those 10 minutes. She says, "I want accountability. I want this to be about making sure this does not happen to someone else." Her voice is not artful. It is direct. It lands in the space between anger and hope. The viral clip becomes, for a while, the hinge of local conversation. Opinions ripple, some defensive, some outraged. The department issues a statement, an investigation is underway, and training will be reviewed. Donovan appears in front of a camera, hands folded, carefully scripted. The community, especially those who organize around policing issues, do not let the words stand alone. They call for reforms. Better implicit bias training, clearer stop and search policies, community oversight boards with teeth. A citizens advisory board is convened. It includes pastors, neighborhood leaders, a local attorney, and Angela herself. She joins because she knows how quickly indignation can fade back into everyday life if it is not harnessed into structures that last. She remembers the weight of her phone in her hand in the dark and how small comforts, like having someone to call, can be the difference between humiliation and safety. The board's first meeting is messy, full of honest anger and honest weariness. It is also full of proposals. You can't just train people out of bias overnight, a pastor says. But training coupled with accountability, clear data, and community oversight could change how stops happen. They draft recommendations. Clear criteria for stops, mandatory body-worn cameras left on for the duration of contact, public access to redacted reports, a faster timeline for disciplinary review when officers' conduct is questioned. Some of the community's proposals are hard-edged, others are pragmatic. They ask for an independent audit of the department's stop and search data over the past 2 years. They ask for information on how complaints are handled. They ask for transparent timelines. The department responds in stages. Some changes happen quickly. The formation of an advisory group, a promise of more robust training on de-escalation. But others require negotiation and budget votes. One officer resigns, a decision framed by internal counsel as voluntary. The announcement arrives quietly and is met with a split reaction. Some call the resignation insufficient. Others see it as a sign the system, imperfect as it is, can still respond to public pressure. Angela becomes more public in the weeks that follow, not for spectacle but for purpose. She begins speaking at forums and at community centers, using the experience as a lens through which to talk about dignity and process. She organizes a small event at the community center, where she had come from the night of the stop, and people come with their own stories. Some stories are about stops that led to apologies, others end in much darker places. Each person's narrative is a piece of evidence that there is a pattern worth addressing. Malcolm does not stand on a stage and declare himself infallible. He acknowledges the friction his dual identity creates. At a town hall, a resident asks whether having a commissioner as a spouse gave Angela special leverage. Malcolm answers plainly, "Institutional power brought attention in this case, and attention can accelerate accountability. But attention isn't justice by itself. The systems and the people who serve within them have to change." That distinction becomes central to how the couple frames the aftermath. They try not to let the personal sting of what happened ossify into a private war. They speak together about civic responsibility, about the ways people can demand change through participation. They also talk about limits. That one viral video cannot fix structural inequity, but it can create pressure points that make change possible, if sustained. In the weeks that follow, two parallel tracks unfold. One is procedural. The internal review compiles interviews, body cam footage where it exists, and the notes from officers. The other is public. Community pressure, local news coverage, and talk shows pick at the edges of the story. People interpret events through the habits of their own lives, through fear, through anger, through hope. Angela keeps returning to the idea that dignity is not a private currency. It is a public good that must be defended in policy as well as in practice. When the investigators release their findings in the narrative that follows, they are careful with language. No dramatic declarations, only procedural conclusions. They cite lapses in documentation and in the articulation of reasonable suspicion. They point to failure in following protocol for searches. The discovery that the officers could not provide sufficient justification for the search is not presented as a criminal indictment in court, but as evidence of procedural failure. The department announces disciplinary action, which leads to a reshuffling of responsibilities and the resignation that was earlier hinted at. The public response is mixed. Some say it is not enough, others call it a step forward. The advisory board continues. They measure their victories not in headlines but in minutes, a tighter stop-and-search policy, promised quarterly reports on community complaints, new training modules developed with local civic groups instead of being outsourced. They push for better data collection so patterns can be seen as patterns and not as isolated incidents. They also create a public-facing dashboard where residents can see anonymized statistics about stops and complaints. Angela's activism takes a form that blends the personal with the political. She begins hosting workshops on citizens' rights during traffic stops, signing them, "Know Your Rights, Dignity on the Road." She brings in legal aid volunteers and local leaders to explain what is permissible and what should be documented. The workshops are practical, not revolutionary. How to record interactions with a phone safely, how to ask for supervisor information, how to request a copy of a report. They teach a kind of civic armor for people whose lives include driving at night after a community event, for parents dropping kids at rehearsals, for anyone whose evening might contain a moment of inexplicable scrutiny. Her engagement is not only about self-defense. It also becomes a way to build relationships with officers who want better training. At one workshop, a young officer in civilian clothes shows up, not the older one from the stop, but a new recruit who says quietly, "I want to know how to do this right." The room listens with a mix of suspicion and hope. Policymaking, Angela realizes, will require people who are willing to change from both sides to work toward common practices that preserve public safety and personal dignity. Over time, the immediate sting of humiliation begins to thicken into something that propels rather than paralyzes. She takes her experiences to city council meetings, to neighborhood associations, to reporters who are willing to ask the right questions. She presses for the adoption of the advisory board's recommendations, grounding each request in concrete examples and potential policy language. There are setbacks, budget shortfalls, department resistance, people who simply do not see the problem the way others do. But there are also incremental wins, a new training curriculum, a pledge to increase transparency, an independent audit commissioned by the city. Through it all, Malcolm is careful not to perform. He sits in the back of town halls and lets Angela speak. When he does appear publicly, it's to support structural reforms and to insist on process, not to claim victory. He knows his badge opened a door that might have remained closed, but he also knows that justice is not a badge. Justice requires systems that function even when the person at the scene is not connected to power. Months after the stop at a community forum, Angela tells a roomful of people about that night not in order to relive the hurt, but to orient conversation toward what must change. What happened to me should not be an exception in the conversation about policing, she says. It should be an example of how public pressure and procedure can work together to make institutions accountable. But it's not enough for one person to be seen. Everyone needs to be heard. Her voice holds the evenness of someone who has chosen to channel indignation into institution building. The reforms are not magic, they are work. Some officers adapt, others chafe. The Citizens Advisory Board fights for timely reporting. In one meeting, an older supervisor asks, "How do we keep our officers safe while also ensuring the public feels respected?" The question hangs without an easy answer. Angela and the board propose training that focuses on communication and on minimizing unnecessary escalation, coupled with metrics that track outcomes not just in arrests, but in community trust. They push for external audits. They propose that complaint processes be publicly visible so that patterns can be spotted early. A year after the curbside stop, the department releases a report summarizing changes, new de-escalation modules, clearer guidance on probable cause and articulable suspicion, and improved complaint handling processes. The public reception is cautious optimism. Some view it as progress, others view it as the minimum expected. The story does not end in a triumphant sweep. It settles into the more complicated truth. Structural change is messy and slow, and those who experienced harm carry traces of it for a long time. Angela still feels the memory of the flashlight on her face when she walks past police cruisers. Some nights the replay is involuntary, a small knot of anger that no reform can entirely unpick. Yet she continues to go to meetings and to lead workshops because public dignity, she believes, is defended by persistent attention. She uses her platform to push for laws that would codify transparency. She joins a coalition that lobbies for mandatory, independent review of use of force incidents in the county. Her leadership is not flashy. It is the steady accumulation of demands that shape policy. The community, too, changes in subtle ways. There are more conversations at PTA meetings, at church gatherings, at city council sessions. People no longer treat a traffic stop as a private moment alone to be borne, but as a public encounter where one's rights and one's dignity must be respected. The presence of phone cameras, which some had thought of as intrusive, is now generally accepted as a measure of public accountability, albeit an imperfect one. The advisory board insists on a public education campaign about when and how to record interactions responsibly. In quiet moments, Angela and Malcolm sit together and talk about what happened. They talk about privilege and exposure. They talk about the fact that a commissioner's badge changed the dynamic in a way that should not be the determinant of whose dignity is protected. Malcolm says, "This should have been handled right whether I was there or not." Angela replies, "That's the point." They both know that one incident, no matter how public, cannot fix a system by itself. But they also know that silence would have been worse. As the months unfold, a pattern emerges. Individual incidents, given attention and structured with policy demands, become pressure points for institutional change. The resignation of one officer and the new training modules are not the end of the story, but they are not nothing either. The advisory board's dashboard begins to show a slow decline in complaints around stops that lack documented cause. It's too soon to declare victory, and the activists who work with Angela are careful not to celebrate prematurely. Still, there is a sense that sustained civic engagement nudged a bureaucracy toward reform that might otherwise have been deferred. The ending of this particular narrative is not cinematic closure, so much as a quiet invitation. Angela stands once more at the community center where the fundraiser took place, a year later, greeting neighbors and new organizers. She watches as a young volunteer hands out pamphlets that include a line she helped draft: "Your dignity is not conditional." The line reads simple in black print, but it carries the weight of nights and meetings and public testimony. The story begins and ends with small human acts: the pull of a seatbelt, the glint of a badge, the hand that returns a phone. It holds the discomfort of a woman stopped without an explanation and the corrective force that public scrutiny can exert when institutions are pushed to account. It honors the fact that change is rarely swift, but can be real when people, those affected, those within institutions, and the community, refuse to let a single event pass without consequence. If this account moves you, and you want to help sustain the kind of accountability Angela and her neighbors worked for, consider sharing this story with someone who needs to hear it, or connecting with local groups that promote police transparency and community oversight. Public pressure sustained over time is the kind of force that turns indignation into lasting reform.